Hello, class. Welcome back after your Easter break. I hope you all had a very enjoyable break. So, today we're going to continue our lessons on social stratification in the United States. And we talked about, just by way of review, that when we're talking about social stratification in the US, we're usually talking about economic or socioeconomic stratification. And it's very hard to separate the two, social and economic, in the United States. Whereas, in older times, and even to some extent today, in some European nations that have nobility, there can be social stratification that is entirely independent of economic capabilities or earnings or net worth or any economic qualifier. So it wouldn't have been uncommon, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, for someone to be a member of the nobility and be entirely broke, right? Have no money, but be held in higher social esteem than someone who was a wealthy merchant and had more money. So that would be a more of a European model. Whereas in America, our social standing is tied directly to our economic standing. Generally speaking, in today's social media trend, there can be people that have a higher social standing that may not have the same economic capabilities or capacities, but that social standing allows them to attain a higher economic standing. Someone that has 1 million followers on Instagram, they can sell merchandise, for example. They might get paid to advertise. They might have sponsors, people that advertise on their content or people that sponsor their content. So that social standing can lead to higher economic standing. So that they're still tied together to some extent in America. Today, I just wanted to give a little bit of data, hard data, because we had talked about in more nebulous terms or more esoteric terms the idea of social stratification and economic stratification in America. But I wanted to give some numbers today just to kind of give people a general idea of what the stratification looks like, where the lines are in America with hard numbers. So let's start at the top. So the top 1% in America, socioeconomically, the economic top 1%. This is a stat from 2019. If a person makes an annual income of $421,926 a year, so over $420,000 a year, that makes them nationally in the top 1%. But for our state, the number is actually lower. So in the state of Pennsylvania, you're in the top 1% if you make around $388,000 a year. And that's a 2018 stat, by the way. So we'll talk a little bit later in this video about geography matters. And socioeconomic status, it depends on how much you make, but you're more likely to be in a higher socioeconomic class if you live in certain areas in the United States. And some of these may be surprising to you. Okay, so what about the top 10%? Well, that number is actually considerably lower. It's still high, but it's considerably lower. So a household would be in the top 10% if they make $118,000 a year. And that's a 2017 stat. So in the US, and that's for nationwide, not just the state of Pennsylvania. So nationwide, you're in the top 1% if you make almost $422,000 a year. You're in the top 10% if you make $118,000 a year. And then the numbers start to get very interesting from there because the gap between 50%, we're looking at median, not mean, by the way. So we're looking at median income, not mean, for the 50% mark here. The median household income, so right in the middle. So if you take all the household incomes and you just pick the middle right out, the median household income in 2017 was $59,000. So the gap between top 1% and top 10%, it's around $300,000 a year in income, right? That's from 1% to 10%. The gap from 10% to 50% is about $60,000. So that gap gets a lot narrower and narrower as we go up or down. So like if you're in the top 10% to top 50%, right? That 40% gap is only $60,000. But a 9% gap between the top 1% and the top 10%, that's $300,000. So I find that to be very interesting as far as those statistics are concerned. The poverty line in the United States, as far as socioeconomic status is concerned, and this is a 2020 stat. The poverty line for a household of 4 people, all right, is $26,000. It's 26.2. So from 50% mark to poverty line, it's an even smaller gap than top 10% to median income. And then the bottom 10% for a household in America, if you're in the lowest 10%, the top margin of the lowest 10% would be $14,600. And that's a 2019 stat. So it's a big jump from the bottom 10% to the top 10%, right? But even if you jump from the bottom 10% to the top 10%, it's going to take you exponentially more money, not quite literally exponentially, obviously, but significantly more money to do that. That's $100,000 a year, right? Than it is to jump from the top 10% to the top 1%. That's another $300,000 a year. And that would be our general stratification in the U.S. as far as socioeconomic status is concerned, right? But the thing about that is social mobility is a very big part. We talked about this, but by way of review, that people can move up or down this ladder very freely in America, whereas in some other areas of the world, when it's just social status and not socioeconomic status, social mobility is not really a thing, or it's very rare. One has to be part of the peerage to be able to be socially elevated. And that's only done by the monarchy. The monarchy would, bestow a title upon someone, and that's how they would be a part of the peerage. Whereas in America, if you can increase your earning potential, then you move up socioeconomically. And we already talked about, by way of review, a lot of the benefits that come from that, like increased access to education, increased access to healthcare, generally better health in general. Because oftentimes in lower income areas, there are higher obesity rates, which lead to higher type 2 diabetes rates and high blood pressure and other things like that, that are health complications that statistically are more likely to occur in lower income areas. Then there's also just, malnutrition and other things like that are more common in lower income areas as well. But here let's talk about geographically. This is something very intriguing to me, that geographically it has an impact. Where one lives has an impact on one's socioeconomic potential. Generally speaking, one is more likely to be in a higher socioeconomic class or a lower socioeconomic class, depending upon where that person lives. So some of the highest income states in America, these wouldn't necessarily be what we would expect, right? Connecticut is one of the higher income states in the U.S. Hawaii, Alaska, Maryland, and New Jersey, right? So we might have been expecting maybe Alaska, if you know about all the oil that goes on there, and some other things that go on there, like, there's prospecting that still occurs in Alaska. Connecticut, though, Maryland, those might be outliers as far as what people would predict as far as highest income states in the U.S. They're among the highest income states. And then the average states that just be generally average income, or, somewhere in between high and low, states like Nebraska, Iowa, Georgia, Nevada, those would be more average income states in the United States, where they're not in the highest, they're not in the lowest, as far as the average income a person would make in that state. And then low income states or regions in the U.S., D.C. would be one, West Virginia, Arkansas, Idaho, Mississippi, Alabama also. These would be lower income states. But like Mississippi is very low income statistically, West Virginia as well, and DC has a lot of impoverished regions. So by state, by geography where one lives, it can have an impact on one's socioeconomic status. That's not to say that someone that lives in West Virginia can't be incredibly rich. There are people who are wealthy that live, in Mississippi or West Virginia, and there are people who are very poor that live in places like Alaska and Hawaii. But if we average it out, that state's average socioeconomic status is higher. And so this is just a really complex issue that's it's hard to quantify sometimes because then we have to factor in things like cost of living. If you make a lower amount of money, but you live in a low cost of living area, if you live in New York City, the cost of living is very high. So what $60,000 a year would buy you is not nearly as much as what it would buy you in some place like Mississippi, right? And even where you live regionally, an urban area versus a rural area also has impact on cost of living. And then also, opportunities can be limited based on geography as well. Like we happen to live in an area that has some teaching hospitals and we have some research that goes on medically. We also have good tech in our area, opportunities for technology and jobs in the technology sector. But people that don't live in an area that has the same opportunities, like if you live in a rural area, your chances of having access to a good teaching hospital, probably not all that great, right? Same with the tech sector. So geography can also impact opportunities. Similarly, people that live in low-income neighborhoods that don't have great access to education and don't have great access to employment opportunities because of the lack of access to education, they're not going to have the same access to opportunities that other people have. So socioeconomic status can impact the earning ability that people might have in the future. So it's a really complex issue, but I just wanted to give you some hard statistics just to look at today. Like, what does top 1% actually mean? What does bottom 10% actually mean in the US? And what can be some impacts that socioeconomic status has in the United States of America geographically and on opportunities? So that's it for today, but just want to encourage you, keep up the good work now that you're coming back from your Easter break. Get back into it with gusto. If you have any questions, feel free to email me anytime. I welcome emails, and I hope you all have a great day and enjoy the lesson.